Alrighty, welcome back to Wook Capital Management's monthly book club. Our Wook book club for this month will cover Michael Maubussin's Think Twice. Before we get into the weeds, please be aware that Wook Capital Management Inc. and its employees solely provide investment advisory services to family clients and do not provide investment advisory services to the general public. Furthermore, investments are highly speculative in nature and involve substantial risk of loss. We encourage investors to obtain advice from your professional investment advisor and to make independent investigations before acting on information that we publish. We cannot assure you that the information is accurate or complete. We do not in any way warrant or guarantee the success of any action you take in reliance on our statements or recommendations. Past performance is not necessarily indicative of future results. All investment decisions of an individual remain the specific responsibility of that individual. Okay, so we are back with our June book club. We're going to talk about Think Twice, which is a great primer on various pitfalls that one can encounter in their decision-making processes. A lot of tips and tricks to try to improve one's decision-making, and yeah, we'll see where the conversation goes from there. So, in terms of the book, it's a pretty quick and easy read, and I think that going through it from in chapter order actually is just fine. Um, so I'll start then with the introduction. Um, I think it was pretty ironic, the characterization, and before I even get to that, I think it's worth noting kind of when this book was published. Obviously, it was published in I think 2009, so a little bit aged. A lot of the discussion is still valid, even though some of the discussion might seem a little bit dated. Um, but yeah, it was interesting in the introduction section. Um, I think the main takeaway is the importance of your decision-making process, understanding your decision-making process as well as that of others, rather than focusing on the outcome, which is a pitfall far too many people fall into. And yeah, it was really ironic, right, to see that you had a professor of psychology who talked about gullibility in fields like finance, academia, and the law, and then he went ahead and lost 30% of his retirement savings as part of Madoff's Ponzi scheme. So, just a good example that started the intro off. Um, but yeah, before we go into the chapters, um, I would just ask Joe, JP, and whomever else what they think, what they thought of the book, I guess, at large. Sorry, I just had to boot somebody who just kept spamming emojis. Uh, yeah. So, what do you guys think of the book?
I thought it was very good. It's a very realistic book. I think there's no fluff. I think he's trying to be as objective as possible, like in every way possible. He talks a lot about psychological aspects of investing and how the human brain works in certain situations, and how even if you try, there's a lot of subconscious thoughts that come up, and trying to fight against that is ultimately like what you have to do, it seems like. And there's a lot of things that he says that I agree with, but it seems like it's going to be very difficult and will take some practice and constantly kind of remind myself of these type of things I should follow, because I do agree with a lot of the things he says. He's very straightforward, and he has a lot of like very good supporting stories and case studies that prove his point to be pretty strong. So I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good book. But I guess we'll go more into detail as we go by chapter by chapter. But overall assessment, yeah, that's kind of like how I felt.
Good stuff. Joe, thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add that this book really teaches you that your intuition may actually be the opposite of what you should do, and obviously that's pretty much expressed in the title. But the fact that people nowadays may think, oh, electric cars seem to be the future, I should invest in Tesla. It's like a very surface level thought and opinion to grab from that data. So think about, are other people having this same impulsive thought, and maybe you should reconsider. Everyone has had this thought, and now the stock is overbought, right? People think AI might be the future, and they go buy Nvidia, and really, you should be thinking more counter intuition, which may tell you, okay, this is what everyone's doing. Maybe I should consider looking at the opposite. And the book overall, though, it's just not a dummies book. Like there's a lot to digest. I wouldn't recommend it to someone who's just getting started in finance. I think there's a lot to learn from it about decision making, but it's still a relatively tough book in my opinion. But the decision making skills obviously can be applied outside of just investing, and I think that is valuable. So overall, I liked the book. It's not my favorite so far in our series, but I can see the reason why it was recommended to us.
I think it's important to remember with Mauboussin, as JP was saying, he liked Maubussin's writing style and kind of clarity of message, and he's just very well regarded in finance, decision making, strategy. Um, he's written plenty of beyond just books, plenty of. There's a really good one just the other week, kind of reviewing return on invested capital kind of trends and which industries have historically realized the best returns on invested capital. And he's done a lot of research over his decades of work, so I think he's not beholden to any like philosophy. He just tries to go where the data goes. And I've read several of his write-ups beyond this one, and I always learn something new when I read Maubussin's work, and it's probably worth reading a second time or more for a lot of what he's has to say and what he's put out there. Um, so okay, we've got seven, what is it, seven, 8 chapters and a conclusion. We got the introduction, which we kind of talked about just a little bit. I guess let's just go through each chapter, kind of talk a little bit about each chapter, implications, our takeaways. Um, so the first chapter was the outside view, and what he means by that is to look at things. How to phrase it? What he says is that our tendency is to consider each problem as unique rather than carefully considering experiences of others. And he uses the example of a racehorse, Big Brown, in the 2008 not Kentucky Derby, the Triple Crown in horse racing. The horse had won the first 2 races, and it was a massive favorite to win the last race. And he kind of goes through the example of how people were kind of so focused on the horse itself, like the inside view, that not enough people stepped back and said, well, what usually happens, or what has happened historically to horses in this position. And the data show that it's only a 15% success rate when horses win the first 2 legs and get to the third leg. And the bettors had priced in more than a 75% chance of the horse winning that last leg. And the horse came in dead last, which is unfortunate for those gamblers. But his point was you need to kind of step back and look at the problem from that outside view. That what are data points I can bring in to the discussion, as opposed to just kind of being up close, uh, with the quote unquote inside view and considering the problem just focused on that task and information that you have available to you. So, uh, Yeah, I also liked in that chapter examples that he shared with what is it the how impactful you know out the information at hand can be on our decision making, and the example of these medical um, treatments where based on the anecdote that's shared with the patient, there's a big spread uh, in the decisions that are made, and people allow themselves to be very influenced by these anecdotes, which may overwhelm their cognitive reasoning otherwise. And the book's filled with all of these various cognitive biases. It's really a recurring theme throughout. But when you're looking at these things, just to at least have the awareness of these biases that we have. He calls out. He didn't call it out in the phrase, but he had cited an example from Justin Kruger and David Dunning, the well-known Dunning-Kruger effect. This illusion where the people who are least capable often have the largest gap between what they think they can do and what they can actually achieve. So people that are novices in something are going to way overestimate their capacity to perform well than those that are way at the other end of the spectrum who are experts. The experts are often going to underestimate themselves. So that's just one of the biases they call out in chapter one. I don't want to rehash it all. What were some of the other things from chapter one that stood out to you guys, or in line with what I was talking about?
I think you covered, yeah, those are definitely one of the most important parts. I think he also went on to talk about the planning fallacy. So they did the test with, they did a study with all the students and the percentage of likely that they could complete the task within a certain period of time. And it turned out like they were so far off. And in fact, like less than 20% completed it at the time that they thought they would complete it. Well, different for each percentage of likelihood that they would complete it. But yeah, anyways, the idea was that even they themselves don't fully understand themselves, and we tend to overestimate on things that we think we can do it, but in fact, like a lot of them are wrong about themselves. So and that kind of goes back to that point that you just mentioned about like people who thought of themselves as being a good driver, and when you in fact checked out their legit actual performance versus um, what they thought about themselves, the discrepancy was large, and the more they thought they were good, in fact they were actually way worse than those who didn't think of themselves to be that good. So um, it's interesting to see how, like, if you look at a large scale, a lot of people just, I feel like they think they know, but a lot of them don't know themselves. And there's that other example of the merger and acquisition as well, like where they think the odds are, they always feel like they're in the percentile of being right, even though the odds are against them. So like the M&A, if you look at the actual data, 2/3 of all M&A, after you merge or acquire a company, the acquiring company will lose. The stock prices will start going down, and usually 2/3 of the times that
Yeah.
happens. And the
This
reason why you would acquire a company is because you're trying to create synergy that's greater than the premium you paid for the company. But oftentimes it's quite the contrary. It's the opposite.
Yeah, the sentence I highlighted that I guess succinctly kind of nails what you're getting at, JP, is the explanation is that while most executives recognize that the overall merger and acquisition record is not good, they believe that they can beat the odds. And it's not just the executives in M&A, it's the professional money manager, right? We know the data show that active portfolio managers underperform market indices over time generally, and yet those of us that are trying to do it all believe that we can do it, right? So
Yeah.
I think the inside versus outside view, before we move on to the next chapter, really comes down to how we often just overestimate our own capabilities. We overemphasize the information immediately available to us and in the specific task at hand, when we would just be better suited really stepping back and trying to say, well, actually, in this situation, what has happened before? And there's often a corollary, and there's often data that you can tap into to kind of better inform your decision making process. Joe, any other thoughts on chapter one?
Yeah, for some reason I wasn't a speaker for a second, so I was saying something earlier and I didn't realize my mic wasn't on. But just obviously the chapter one biggest takeaway is about the horse race. That was the big story of the chapter. But I liked the overall concept for me was just that we view our problems as unique, right? Like we all think that, oh, our situation's never, no one's been in our situation before, which isn't true most of the time, right? So if we can look back at history and look back at other people that have made this decision because they've been in a similar predicament, we can usually find people or find ways to navigate the situation based on history. So, like, example would be like corporate mergers and acquisitions, right? So, if there's a company that's looking to engage in a deal, there's probably been similar deals made in that same industry that they could look at to discover valuations and things like that. So, that's what I took away from chapter one. Just that, you should never believe that your situation is truly unique because other people have been through it, other companies have been through it, other investors have been through it, and you should look for those stories to help you determine what you should do in your situation.
Yeah, I'll round it out with how he ends each chapter, I think, with a nice little how to incorporate this, or how to avoid this particular pitfall. And he says, how to incorporate the outside view. Select a reference class. So find these related situations, to Joe's point, that it's probably happened before in some capacity. Assess the distribution of outcomes. Make a prediction. Uh, and then assess the reliability of that prediction and fine tune it. He talks about the example of football, which I thought was actually a really interesting one, because I've heard this before where statistically, or at least with the actual like underlying data, he talks about this computer program that assesses coaches' play calling, and we know on like 4th and 1 or 4th and 2 or whatever, oftentimes coaches are going to punt rather than go for it. And he doesn't go into this detail in it here, but it's a lot of these little crucial decisions where the vast majority of the time the coaches are making the wrong decision. They're doing maybe what would be the status quo, or what would be like typically accepted, conventional wisdom, so to speak. It talks about 4th downs, kickoffs, 2-point attempts, which obviously the kickoff has changed since 2009, right? So there's a good example. We can't rely on that data per se, because the underlying rules of the game have changed a bit. But yeah, the people making these stale decisions end up scoring fewer points, winning fewer games. Having that willingness to embrace the outside view, can lead to outperformance in that example. So, okay, let's keep going then. I think we can probably go a bit faster through the balance of the book, since it's okay. So chapter 2, open to options. The real emphasis here is the power of anchoring in our bias. I don't I don't have the exact example of mine, but we did something similar to this in one of my classes in undergrad. But the example that he shares, this notion of providing the last 4 digits of your phone number and then answering, your estimate of the number of doctors in Manhattan. Obviously, I'm going to take him at his word, but found that when people had a higher phone number, their estimate was higher, just because they had thought of that thing recently. It had anchored their um, thinking around that arbitrary number that they just thought of, and it just really highlights how powerful the anchoring bias can be. It, and they talked about, even if you do the experiment right after talking about the concept, the bias still holds true. So the discussion around anchoring being a very powerful bias, and that it's predominantly subconscious, which he calls it tunnel vision as well. You know, um, what else? So yeah, I thought it was also interesting about the real estate brokers. I mean, he just gives a few examples, right? That when agents saw a high listing price for appraised for a house, um, I forget how that one works. I'm sorry, losing my train of thought. Uh, yeah, but either way, I mean, just the power of anchoring throughout this chapter really was an eye opener. I mean, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I like the part how, like, if you're tunnel vision, you have like a certain idea. So when you're doing any sort of research, or you're trying to even like model something out, you're pretty much like going towards a direction of what you think is right. So that may have been in a different chapter, or I can't exactly remember, but I remember it seems to be somewhat relevant with this chapter. And then he also talked about how it's more about trying to prove your statement to be incorrect, rather than like trying to just prove your idea to be right. So you have to constantly contradict your views and try to really stress test that. So I thought that was good. And one of the examples that he gave during that, when he was talking about that, was, for example, like a doctor, somebody went
Yeah,
in and he was super fit, and then he's like, "Oh yeah, like this is probably your problem." But turns out when he went home, he had a heart attack, but he never thought of heart attack to be a possibility because
yeah.
of the way he
It's
appeared.
it's a different chapter, but the example in this chapter, in line with what you're saying, is the one where the audience members were being asked, a bunch of surgeons were being asked to vote on choices for surgery, right? There was a new approach, and then there was an old approach. The new approach uh, had a much larger payout for the doctors, right? So they all kind of chose the new approach, but then the speaker goes back and says, "Well, what if this patient is your wife?" And then the doctors all change their response, and it shows the power of incentives in informing their thinking, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because they're
yeah. That's
choosing
right. Yeah.
this novel new approach, which clearly they're going to get paid more, so they're highly incentivized to select. But then when it's someone they care about, the incentives change. They're thinking.
Yeah, and he gave that example about the pilot. He's like, "Why does a doctor do this, but the pilot doesn't?" And he's like, "Well, the pilot would go down with them, whereas the doctor doesn't." Right? I thought that was a good statement. But yeah, I thought actually I don't know what chapter I'm talking about, but like, yeah, the things you mentioned, yeah, I remember them and reading about it, and they're definitely good points. And if whatever I'm talking about, wherever that chapter comes from, I like that part too.
Chapter 2, for me at least, takeaway was that we all fail to really consider our alternative options when we're like under pressure. And obviously, this takes me back to GameStop. The pressure, seeing that stock move the way it did 3 years ago, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. No one acted rationally in any sort of
Yeah.
way. It was very hard to do
I
so
jotted that down in my notes
because you're under
too.
that pressure.
I jotted that
Yeah,
exactly
yeah,
down too.
that was mine.
Avoid making decisions while at emotional
Yep,
extremes. That immediately came to my mind.
yep. Emotional extremes. I remember that. Just seeing, and that day it hit 120, and then in of the blink of an eye, chopped back down to 60. Like, oh,
Oh yeah,
emotional
no, I'm
turmoil.
with you there.
Just watching the what was my life savings just get cut in half. Just and feeling like I was being greedy. It was yeah, and then the stock obviously from 60 it budgeted
But it's kind of crazy because when
nearly
GameStop
8x from there.
that situation happened, I mean, I was super emotional. Like my heart was racing. Like I was like, holy shit! Like I was like super distracted with work and everything. But I specifically had a price target of 380. So like I was like, I just like I don't have like a rhyme and reason as to why it was like 380, but it was just 380. And then so I wasn't like panicking in terms of like when I should sell. Like I was just like, okay, if it gets the 380, but like so it wasn't affecting my decision anyway, but I was like super emotional.
Yeah, he says
I was thinking about
Yeah, I think
stress,
while doing
anger, fear, anxiety, greed, and euphoria are antithetical to quality decisions. And I think it would, even with that week, right? It's very important to step back and again, just because the outcome ended up being favorable, right? Were they the correct decisions? Uh, I'm not sure, right? Had Elon Musk not tweeted, right, what might have happened? It probably would have been a very different outcome. So, it's always hard to play, and he kind of talks about how it's hard to play those what if games. But yeah, I mean, it's just a very prime example. I mean, we clearly all three of us in that example were overcome by the power of uh, emotions impacting our decision making. Because if you would have ever told me, why are you still holding it after $200 per share or whatever? Because there's no fundamental reason it should have ever gone that high, right? Um, yeah, I remember how kind of talking to the other people who were in the mix at that point in time helped a little bit with those emotional extremes, but did it lead to better decision making? I mean, again, the outcome was favorable, but was it really the right process? I don't know.
I think in his later chapters he talks about that. He talks about how for a small chance that whatever you think is going to happen, trying to bet on that type of thing is just not recommended. Even if it can happen. It's just if it's super unlikely and you're just banking on one outcome, it's dangerous.
Yeah, but again, the anchoring and the fact that it's largely subconscious just really shouldn't be understated. Uh, so even understanding these biases, we can still be susceptible to them. But hopefully, if we think twice, we'll be less susceptible. So okay, let's keep going then. Chapter 3, the expert squeeze. Which actually I enjoyed the example. I mean, again, this is a a relic of it of when it was written. So talking about Netflix and the algorithm that Cinematch, Netflix's algorithm pairing which movie rentals people would want to watch next with their historical watch experience, etc. Being far better than just the human, the clerk, the so-called expert. And like the main theme of this chapter is that rules-based approaches, which in a world of AI, right? I would love to hear his revised thinking on this chapter because the power of experts presumably is even more diminished, or the value of experts is even more diminished now than it was 15 years ago, 14 years ago. Um, he talks about a few things in here that I'll call out. So, um, let me look my notes. A quote: a relatively uninformed crowd could better predict than the firm's experts. So this was the example he gave of Best Buy, who had an in-house forecasting team, and for retailers, of course, forecasting holiday sales is paramount. If they stock up too much, they're fucked. If they don't stock up enough, their customers are going to be mad and not going to come back next time. But that the few hundred people in the organization, given some basic background information, came within 0.5% accuracy, whereas the official forecast was off by several points. And they did this the next year, and it worked out again, where the amateur crowd was far more accurate than the experts. Um, so I like the wine equation a lot, as somebody who's a big nerd and who thinks wine is, kind of silly, because it's like the bottle, the price in the bottle is typically judged to be, whatever is more expensive is better. But I enjoyed that the Yale econometrician and law professor had come out with a value for wine based on rainfall and seasonal temperatures, that ended up being, far more accurate than the other way. So there's a bunch of examples in the chapter beyond that. The Harrah's Casino example I thought was another good one with people intuitively, the experts think, oh, we got to cater to our high rollers to generate more profits, but they found actually monetizing your older, more frequent maybe users was a better way. But yeah, definitely this was an interesting one.
I was curious how they were determining how their mathematical equation for the wine outperformed. Like, yeah, I'm just curious. Like, what are they basing that off of?
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I'm not asking.
Yeah, I didn't read
like that. Yeah.
The footnote.
Yeah, and I wonder if that Harrah's case still holds to be true these days, because the high rollers these days are at another level. So, I've read many sources that indicate that high rollers are the main
I don't
reason
think it's saying that the high rollers aren't valuable.
important. Yeah, but yeah, I get that, but yeah.
We know Joe's not very valuable to Harrah's and the other casinos.
I'm a very safe gambler. I will say I'm one of the only. I think you might have walked away with some money too when we played baccarat. I think everyone else took an L that day.
Yeah, I got taken out.
So I like the visual he put in the book with the value of experts, where there's certain situations where experts would be less valuable, right? A wide range of probabilistic outcomes, as well as just even a limited range of probabilistic outcomes. A collective would be better than the expert. Really, it's interesting, right? Because he cites the rule-based wide range of outcomes, such as chess or Go. Experts would generally be better than computers, and he does note in what he writes that eventually computers are likely to be better. And of course, in the time since Go, the computers have beaten humans at Go. Chess has happened even before he wrote the book. It had happened. So it just really shows that computers are going to be very good in these rule-based approaches, better than experts. And then when it's a probabilistic approach, you're better off just getting a whole collective of people to provide their thoughts rather than going to the expert. And I think it was interesting, though, where you kind of called out that, all right, so this diversity prediction theorem tells us that a diverse crowd will always predict more accurately than the average person in the crowd. But then there's 3 specific criteria that need to be true: that the crowd is diverse, that it's aggregated, and it's also incentivized. So I thought the example of the NFL and the athletic combines was interesting, because you would think, right, your intuition, I think, would tell you that, oh, this quarterback is the best at the combine, he's probably going to be best, and so on for the other positions. But the data that he shared kind of showed that there was no consistent relationship, because it wasn't a diverse group, right? It was all athletes, all football players. And while they might have been incentivized and aggregated, that theorem didn't hold true. But thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that makes me wonder if, say, you got all the chess grandmasters in the world, put them all in one room, and put them up against Stockfish or one of the best chess AIs. Like, do they stand a chance? Because the AI is only getting better and better when it comes to games like chess, and even like a game like Go, which is similar to chess, but it's like a bit more complicated. There's a lot more possible outcomes. Only recently was AI able to defeat like the best player. So I am curious when it comes to because I love chess. Makes me wonder if you get all the experts together, could they beat an AI? I personally, I don't think so. I don't
I
think so.
don't think
Not
with
anymore.
chess it would help because you're going to have such disparate styles. It's going to be hard for people to get to
Exactly.
consensus.
Yeah, yeah. Everyone has a different language. Every pro, and they play. And there's openings and everything that. But
But
I,
actually, yeah, the computer is pretty much way better than the
yeah, it's
greatest
insane.
grandmasters. It's not even close. Like I think, um, I mean, they it's a computer. They understand every possible outcome, and so
But in 2000,
Maybe we need a Wook chess
nine, the
club.
compute power of those computers wasn't there yet. But yeah, it's it's definitely there today. Um,
wait, just quick question while we're 1 second question. What's your guys' elo?
I haven't been like rated in God knows how long. I haven't played enough.
I'm like a 11, 1100, 1200 on a good day.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's probably like it depends. I guess if I actually were playing for a few weeks, it'd probably be like 16, 17 plus. But it's been a while since I've played.
Ooh, all right. That's pretty good.
Damn, that's solid.
Um, all right, so let's keep going. We've got chapter 4, situational awareness, which I thought it was interesting. He goes through kind of some of these different experiments that have been done to kind of um, draw out the impacts of these different things that drive our behavior. The you're with a group of respondents, and it's one of the famous social psychology experiments where you're trying to study how people conform under group pressure, and you know, people. There's 8 of you. You're the last person to go. The 7 people before you all provide the wrong answer, and uh, you know, only one. Sorry, 1/3 of the subjects conformed to the group's incorrect judgment, and the the orchestrator of the experiment points out the 3 categories to explain those: the distortion of judgment, of action, of perception. Um, yeah, I thought that was interesting. It really, even most interesting in the chapter to me was the wine buying example, where people's decision to buy which bottle of wine, whether it was a French or a German bottle, was so heavily influenced by the music that they subconsciously heard while they were shopping. I mean, it's just incredible. I wouldn't have thought that the data would show how impactful priming people can be, but it's right there. And while I want to argue with it and say there's no way in hell, I have to acknowledge that it must be true. I mean, look,
I didn't think it was that crazy. I think it kind of makes sense
yeah,
for me.
I don't know.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. It's
It,
like nature versus nurture. It's like pure nurture. This talks about how everything around us really shapes like our decisions, but in the grand scheme of life, shapes who we are and what we do, even down to like what we wear. Right.
oh
I've been
yeah,
traveling for
peer
the last few
pressure.
months.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I've been traveling for the last few months, and everyone I've noticed when people travel in a group, if it's a family or a group of friends, tend to be dressed pretty similar, right? Maybe they all decide to wear jeans that day, and they all decide to wear a white T-shirt, or they all decide to wear this and that. And just like, oh, what are you gonna wear? And you just kind of look subconsciously like, oh, they're all wearing this, I'm gonna wear that. Or you think of girls that go out, go out and party. Like they tend to end up showing up to the bar or showing up to the club with the same outfit as their friends because they just made the decision based off what the herd was doing, and that's kind of what this chapter is all
Yeah,
about.
I
But
push back on it because
not so
I
much
don't
that
care
exact
what the
topic.
herd does, and I feel like I'm probably an outlier in that regard. Like these people care what other people think, and I don't. Like, it seems like a lot of this is beholden to the which is true, right? A lot of people are very susceptible to social influence and peer pressure, which I get it, but I don't know. I mean, if everyone said the wrong answer, I'm not going to say the wrong answer just because they're saying it. But clearly, a lot of people will, and the data substantiates that. And then I guess the other kind of thing from this chapter that's worth kind of talking about for a second is the power of default. And he talks about organ donors in Germany, how in Australia it's opt out, so almost 100% of people opt not to opt out of organ donation, whereas in Germany it's opt in, and very few people opt in. And this is something seen through not just Mauboussin calling it out. Richard Thaler calls it out a lot. He won the Nobel Prize kind of on all this behavioral economic stuff and how powerful little like nudges can be. But like the power of default, thinking about finance, right? Just if you had a 401k on by default, like sure, people can opt out of it; they're not forced into it. But I've seen plenty of data in line with that, power of default, where the people that are opted in or not opted in, the people who are by default in are far less likely to turn it off or go away from it. Whereas if there is no default on, and you have to opt in, it kind of shows what similar to what happens with this organ donation outcome. But I like that phrase, libertarian paternalism. It's like we're trying to position things better, knowing how inertia is such a powerful force, but people do have the choice. Well, that was interesting.
Yeah, I wrote that understand the rules that govern the entire system rather than the rules that drive the individual participants. So like everyone has their own rules when it comes to investing. Oh, maybe when a stock returns 20%, that's when they decide to sell. Or if a stock falls 20%, that's when they decide to sell. It's everyone has their own internal dialogue telling them what to do when they invest. And I like that point that you should really understand the rules that govern the entire system. Like people don't all follow the same rules. Everyone makes their own rules, and you should try to just follow the rules that everyone has to follow.
Yeah, and he compares that with the ant. Don't try to study the ant, study the colony. And I thought that was a good example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and the example of the park rangers screwing up the ecosystem of Yellowstone was also
Oh
really good,
yeah,
right? You're focusing on
yeah.
this one animal without considering the entirety of the system, and caused more trouble. Even though your intentions, right? The intentions were obviously good, but it didn't matter. They ended up causing more trouble. Um, yeah, I didn't jot down too much on this chapter.
Yeah, that one was just like one big point, and that's what Joe talked about,
It
and
was
a couple
interesting, the
examples. But
discussion around mean reversion, which he talks about more in some of the following chapters, but how when a
yeah,
company hires a star, the star's performance plunges. There's a sharp decline in the functioning of the group or team the person works with, and the company's market value falls. So it's kind of like, and I don't know if this holds true right to sporting, but you think about how often these you know, teams go out and overpay for this one player, and then it's like, well, now you've maybe hurt the entirety of the team because yeah, you brought in this one guy, but maybe he doesn't mesh with the team. Now you have less resources you can allocate across the organization. Um, yeah, that was interesting. All right, let's keep going then. Chapter 6, evidence of circumstance. Yeah, I thought that was I'm a firstborn of, I have two siblings. So it was interesting to hear the study that was eventually, I guess, kind of disproven, talking about, how behaviors for, firstborn versus later born, are varied, but that it really comes down to the environment in which you're asking those questions. So like it may look different at home how the, first versus second versus third and beyond born, engage and interact. But that, Mauboussin provided the example of his own kid who was really loud at home, but teachers were like, why won't your kid speak? Is, are they mute? In school. So it's like the environment you're in obviously varies, can lead to very meaningful perceptions of things. The discussion on kind of these, what's the term? He called it was a Colonel Blotto. I'd never heard of it before. I'm trying to think of what the term was, but that he used to describe it. What else? So talked about the Norse who went to Greenland, tried to keep doing things the way they'd done it in Norway and in Scandinavia. And it was a very different environment, and they died out because they didn't adapt to the environment around them. They just stuck with what they knew, assumed it would keep working. It didn't. Talks about, correlation not being causal. Kind of calls out the risks of that, and yeah. Remember that there is no best practice in domains with multiple dimensions. That was the phrase I was looking for. The multiple dimensions being, in baseball, I think they use the example of baseball in that chapter a bit, where there's a higher degree of variance in, baseball outcomes than there is in other sports, because there's more dimensions. Yeah, I don't know much else for that one.
Yeah, I really didn't have any major takeaways from this chapter. Just that we generalize things too much, and it's not always the best thing to do, and sometimes it might be the wrong thing to do. That's all I really took away from it. I didn't really like this one.
All right, chapter 7, grand wombs, however one pronounces that. Yeah, a couple interesting concepts with the bridge example. The idea that there's a, what is the term? Phase transition. That's it. A small incremental change in cause leads to large scale effects. So the bridge example, right? Once you get past 156 people and you have 10 more people walking across the bridge, it leads to a massive wobble in the bridge, which obviously they fixed since then. But and these sorts of things that it's hard to like tell, right? Like you wouldn't have been able to glance at the bridge and said, oh, we know that once you get over 156 people, that there's going to be a phase transition there where it starts to really move laterally, and that these phase transitions are very difficult to understand. But I think about the corollary with investing, and I think about it from if you can identify a phase transition from a company that's doing just fine, and that there's something that's going to lead to them declining, whether it's becoming incapable of paying their debts, whatever that. If you can identify that sort of phase transition, like that would lead to huge opportunity. But I don't think it's very easy to do. These critical points and these thresholds. Like the corollary for a company would be, maybe they've been paying a dividend for a long time. People think they're going to keep paying the dividend. But you could identify that because of the underlying financial performance, there's a need to save cash, and they're going to be cutting the dividend, therefore. So you can kind of try and front run, the market, knowing how other market participants are apt to react to that phase transition when it hits. The discussion around the feedback loops from the Earn story. Of course, he had the Nassim Taleb Turkey story, which we're going to read Talib in a few months. So some taste of what's to come there. Um, but yeah, I mean, the big takeaways, I guess, for this chapter were to really try to understand the distribution of outcomes for whatever system it is you're working within, and really try to identify um, those phase transition or those awum moments, as he calls it. What do you guys have for this one?
Yeah, I think you covered it quite well. I mean, the even the he even gave the example of the 1 degree difference between like becoming liquid or freezing, and that's like the same example, supporting example of the bridge and everything. So same thing with stocks. When it goes down, it'll just keep going down. So and I like the section beware of forecast, try to prove people wrong rather than trying to verify it. I think there is a big difference between those two things. Trying to verify what there's right or rather than trying to prove them wrong and prove them trying to prove them wrong will be a better way to find out if it is in fact right or wrong. And then that point earlier we were making on the GameStop betting too much on particular outcome, you want to make sure that you mitigate the downside and capture the upside, but you can't bank on too much on that one particular outcome. That could be dangerous.
Yep. All right. So chapter 8, sorting luck from skill. And I mean, this one definitely aligns with some of the discussion from richer, wiser, happier, kind of about how impactful luck is on things. As much as we don't want to recognize it, especially if it's whether it's a sporting event, if we're the winner, we don't want to acknowledge, how much that gust of wind might have impacted, the ball going in the net or whatever. Um, but I mean, some of the takeaways from him in this chapter that I jotted down. Any system that combines luck and skill will revert to the mean over time. And I thought it was interesting the example of the fund managers, where, excuse me, when they'd had poor results in the previous years, and then they were fired. The fired managers had better returns than the ones that were hired, who had had fantastic results in the preceding years, but whose returns uh, kind of reverted toward the mean. So I mean, there's a couple other examples. The pilots where they, if they commit a mistake, they're always ragging on them, and then if you give them a pat on the back because they did so well, they probably were way beyond the mean, so they're probably going to do worse next time anyway. But just the overarching theme around mean reversion really stuck with me, and I don't know, I feel like in this stock market has not had a mean reversion moment where yeah, the market wasn't great last year, but typically, as Marx noted, right, in the most important thing in these cycles, the pendulum usually swings. You know, when you have a mean reversion, it usually doesn't stop at the mean. So, when you're way over on something, you're going to revert back toward the middle. But when it comes to financial markets, you're typically going to go past the middle and way toward the under. We haven't had that yet. We're probably going to have it at some point. When, of course, is the magic question. But um, yeah, he talked about trying to evaluate how much skill versus how much luck there is in the system you're analyzing. I think it's really important. It's really hard. Um, and obviously the sample size piece. I thought the example he shared where it's like, oh, if you go to a restaurant and you have a great experience, you get the best of the best from them. Well, it's almost axiomatic that your next experience is not going to be as good because it's going to revert toward the mean. And then where maybe you didn't have a good experience the first time, you don't go back. So now you have that limited sample size, and you're going to maybe make a bad decision as a result of it. So you need to be aware of that sort of thing. But yeah, I thought this was a good chapter. The discussion around the you know tall parents having children who they're going to be a little bit shorter than they are because you're going to have that mean reversion over time, even though the overall distribution won't change. Okay. And then lastly, the conclusion, which kind of leaves us with Mauboussin giving us some takeaways. I bold and underlined this line. Think twice's value comes in situations where the stakes are sufficiently high and where your natural decision-making process leads you to a suboptimal choice. Right? So you don't have to think twice every time, but if it's a high-stakes situation and those cognitive biases, whether it's anchoring, whether it's an expert said it, so we're going to try to believe the expert, whatever, all these different biases we talked about. You really want to try to step back and try to use that outside view, try to obtain, if there is any other information that you can obtain, et cetera, et cetera. He talks about putting yourself in the shoes of others as a very powerful way to facilitate better decision making. But I mean, all in all, the book isn't really an investing specific discussion. It's very much a better decision making discussion. And I think he's got a lot of good tidbits that we got to talk about in there. And yeah, I enjoyed it. JP, I don't know if you or Joe would add anything. Otherwise, we can call it there.
Yeah, no, I thought it was good. And yeah, nothing on my end, but I agree with you. It was good.
All right. So programming wise, we will have our open mic tomorrow night at 7. We'll have our book in review Friday at the close, and we'll be back at the end of July with our next book club read, which, JP, do you know? I was trying to find our list, what our book is for July.
I don't have it on top of my head.
All right. Well, we'll distribute it on Friday in the newsletter. So be sure to you can click the little newspaper icon and be sure to sign up so you're getting those Friday mornings. And thanks everybody for your interest in our book club discussion on Think Twice. We'll talk.
Actually, I got it. It's Mastering the Market Cycle.
Great. So we'll be back next time, last Tuesday in July at 8 p.m. for Mastering the Market Cycle. Cheers, everyone.